The Soviet blueprint for disaster. The blueprints for China's deadliest engineering disaster didn't originate in Beijing. They came straight from Moscow, designed by Soviet engineers who prioritized communist propaganda over Chinese lives. When Stalin's technical advisors arrived in China during the early 1950s, they brought with them a dam-building philosophy that would prove catastrophically unsuited to Chinese conditions. These Soviet specialists dismissed centuries of Chinese flood management knowledge, replacing traditional techniques with standardized designs that had already failed across the Soviet Union. Stalin's approach to dam construction emphasized speed and visual impact above all else. Soviet engineers received explicit instructions to create massive concrete monuments that would demonstrate socialist superiority to the world. The Banqiao Dam became one of these showcase projects, designed not according to local geological conditions or weather patterns, but according to standardized Soviet specifications that prioritized construction speed and propaganda value. Soviet technical manuals specified concrete mixing ratios and earth-fill compaction methods that worked adequately in the stable geological conditions of Western Russia, but proved disastrously inadequate for the unstable alluvial soils of central China. The specific technical failures began with the Soviet concrete formulation itself. Soviet engineers specified a concrete mixture with insufficient reinforcement steel and inadequate aggregate bonding for Chinese geological conditions. The earth-filled dam core used Soviet compaction techniques designed for clay-heavy soils, not the sandy alluvial deposits common along Chinese rivers. These techniques created internal weaknesses that would prove fatal when subjected to the hydraulic pressures generated by Chinese typhoon conditions. Soviet spillway designs assumed gradual spring snowmelt patterns typical of Russian rivers, not the sudden massive water volumes delivered by Pacific typhoons. Chinese engineers who had managed flood control successfully for over 2 millennia found their expertise systematically dismissed. Traditional Chinese dam construction used flexible bamboo and stone techniques that bent with flood pressures rather than resisting them. Chinese flood management philosophy emphasized multiple smaller barriers and controlled flooding of designated areas during extreme weather events. Soviet advisors rejected these approaches as primitive and unscientific, insisting that massive concrete barriers could completely control natural water flows through brute engineering force. Internal Soviet documents from the 1950s reveal that Moscow's engineers understood the fundamental inadequacies of their standardized designs when applied to Chinese conditions. Technical reports filed by Soviet specialists acknowledged that Chinese rivers carried sediment loads up to 10 times higher than Russian waterways, that Chinese typhoons delivered water volumes unknown in Soviet experience, and that Chinese geological conditions created foundation stability problems not addressed in Soviet engineering standards. Despite these documented concerns, political pressure from Moscow demanded visible symbols of socialist engineering prowess, and dam construction proceeded using unchanged Soviet specifications. The political imperatives driving these decisions originated at the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Stalin personally ordered the creation of massive infrastructure projects throughout the communist world that would demonstrate socialist superiority over Western engineering achievements. Chinese dams needed to exceed Western projects in scale and construction speed, regardless of local conditions or safety considerations. Soviet engineers received career advancement based on the size and speed of their international projects, not their long-term safety records. This incentive structure encouraged the export of increasingly ambitious designs that pushed beyond proven Soviet engineering capabilities. The Sino-Soviet split of the late 1950s left Chinese engineers with incomplete technical knowledge and no ongoing support for maintaining Soviet-designed infrastructure. When political relations between Beijing and Moscow deteriorated, Soviet advisors withdrew from China, taking with them crucial technical documentation and maintenance procedures. Chinese engineers found themselves responsible for maintaining complex Soviet design systems without access to original design specifications or troubleshooting guidance. Critical maintenance procedures remained locked in Soviet technical manuals that were never translated or transferred to Chinese authorities. Similar Soviet dam failures across the USSR provided clear warnings of the disasters awaiting Chinese infrastructure. The Kirov Dam collapse in 1961 killed over 100 people and demonstrated the fundamental flaws in Soviet concrete formulation techniques. The Typhoon Dam failure in Soviet Central Asia revealed that Soviet earthfill compaction methods created internal weaknesses that became catastrophic under extreme hydraulic pressure. Multiple smaller Soviet dam failures throughout the 1960s followed identical patterns of foundation instability and concrete deterioration that would later destroy Banqiao. But information about these failures never reached Chinese engineers. Soviet training programs for Chinese engineers focused on construction techniques rather than local weather pattern analysis or long-term maintenance requirements. Chinese engineers learned to build Soviet-style dams, but received no education about typhoon hydrology or extreme weather planning specific to Chinese conditions. Soviet meteorological data used in dam design calculations came from Russian weather stations and bore no relationship to Pacific typhoon patterns that regularly affected Chinese river systems. This knowledge gap left Chinese dam operators unprepared for the extreme weather events that their infrastructure would inevitably face. The most damning revelation emerged decades later when declassified Soviet archives revealed that Moscow's advisors had returned home before the critical 1975 typhoon season, effectively abandoning the dams they had designed. Soviet technical support agreements expired in the early 1970s, but no provisions existed for emergency consultation during extreme weather events. When Super Typhoon Nina approached China in August 1975, Chinese engineers faced the crisis with Soviet-designed infrastructure, but no Soviet expertise to guide emergency response procedures. The dams that Moscow had promoted as symbols of socialist engineering superiority became death traps operated by engineers who had never received training for the extreme conditions that would ultimately destroy them. Soviet design philosophy assumed that massive concrete structures could completely control natural forces through engineering dominance. This approach ignored Chinese understanding that successful flood management required working with natural water patterns rather than attempting absolute control. Traditional Chinese techniques used distributed flood management systems that spread extreme water volumes across multiple barriers and controlled flooding areas. Soviet designs concentrated all hydraulic resistance in single massive structures that became catastrophic failure points when their design limits were exceeded. The abandoned Soviet blueprints scattered across China represented more than failed engineering projects. They embodied a fundamental misunderstanding of Chinese environmental conditions and a systematic rejection of centuries of accumulated Chinese flood management wisdom. When Soviet advisors departed, they left behind infrastructure designed for Russian conditions but operated in Chinese environments, creating disaster scenarios that neither Soviet designers nor Chinese operators fully understood. The stage was set for catastrophe, and Chinese communities downstream from Soviet-designed dams would pay the ultimate price for Moscow's engineering arrogance. Voices from the flood. Li Yuhe still remembers the exact moment his world ended. On the night of August 8, 1975, he lost 23 family members when the Banqiao Dam collapsed and sent a wall of water crashing through his village. His parents, his wife, his children, his brothers and sisters, his nieces and nephews, all swept away in minutes by a flood that moved faster than anyone could run. Li survived only because he had climbed onto his roof to secure loose tiles against the typhoon winds. From that vantage point, he watched his entire family disappear beneath the black water that rose 30 feet in less than 20 minutes. Chen Shikue witnessed the complete destruction of human civilization on an almost incomprehensible scale. His village housed over 4,000 people before the dam broke. When rescue workers finally reached the area 5 days later, they found only 400 survivors clinging to debris and rooftops scattered across miles of devastated landscape. Chen spent those 5 days floating on a wooden door, watching the bodies of his neighbors drift past in the murky water. Children, elderly grandparents, pregnant women. The flood made no distinctions. Chen counted over 200 corpses during his time in the water, but stopped counting when he recognized his own daughter among them. The dam workers who witnessed the final hours before collapse provided accounts that reveal the utter helplessness of those responsible for the structure. Zhong Weimin, a maintenance engineer stationed at Banqiao during the typhoon, described water levels rising far beyond anything the dam had been designed to handle. The reservoir filled completely within 6 hours, something that typically took weeks during normal flooding seasons. Zhong watched the concrete spillways crack under the pressure, then saw massive chunks of the dam face shear away as the structure began its final disintegration. He and his colleagues tried to operate the manual release gates, but the mechanisms had already failed under the enormous hydraulic forces. Zhong escaped by motorcycle just minutes before the dam gave way completely. Zhong Mingliang operated the telegraph station responsible for warning downstream communities about rising water levels. As the dam began to fail, he sent increasingly frantic messages to villagers along the flood path, but discovered that most downstream telegraph stations had already lost power due to the typhoon. The few operators who received his warnings found their own communication equipment damaged by the storm. Zhong continued transmitting emergency alerts even as water began flooding the dam control room, but later learned that virtually none of his warnings reached the communities that needed them most. He spent his final minutes at the telegraph key trying to contact regional military units for emergency assistance, then fled when water reached the second floor of the control building. Rescue workers who arrived in the flood zone encountered devastation that defied comprehension. Wang Jiangwo, a People's Liberation Army officer who led one of the first rescue units to reach the affected area, found entire towns that had simply vanished. In places where thousands of people had lived just days earlier, only foundation stones and scattered debris marked former neighborhoods. Wang's unit discovered that the flood had moved buildings wholesale, depositing houses and shops miles from their original locations. Some structures had been picked up intact and relocated to completely different valleys, while others had been reduced to scattered bricks and timber. Wang reported finding perfectly preserved family photographs scattered across the landscape, the only remaining evidence that entire communities had once existed. The children who survived by clinging to debris endured experiences that fundamentally altered their understanding of human mortality. 8-year-old Lu Xiaoming spent 4 days floating on a wooden chest, watching bodies drift past in the floodwater. She described seeing dozens of people who had drowned while trying to save their possessions, their arms still wrapped around bundles of clothes or small furniture pieces. Lu witnessed several elderly people who had survived the initial flood but died from exposure during the days that followed, their bodies joining the stream of corpses that flowed continuously past her makeshift raft. She was eventually rescued by fishermen from an unaffected area upstream, but the psychological impact of witnessing so much death at such a young age created trauma that persists decades later. The psychological damage inflicted by the disaster extends across 3 generations of survivor families. Lu Xiaoming's own children, born years after the flood, experience recurring nightmares about drowning and show abnormal fear responses to heavy rainfall. Her grandchildren, who have never experienced flooding themselves, demonstrate anxiety disorders that mental health professionals directly link to inherited trauma from the 1975 disaster. Survivor families report that children and grandchildren instinctively avoid swimming, refuse to live near rivers, and experience panic attacks during thunderstorms. These psychological patterns appear consistently across hundreds of survivor families, suggesting that the trauma of witnessing mass death creates genetic changes that affect subsequent generations. Survivors consistently describe the sound of the dam breaking as a noise unlike anything else in human experience. Li Yuhe compared it to the sound of mountains being torn apart, a deep grinding and cracking that seemed to come from the earth itself. Other survivors described hearing the concrete structure scream as it disintegrated, followed by a roar like continuous thunder that lasted for over an hour as billions of gallons of water rushed through the breach. Many survivors report that this specific sound still triggers panic attacks decades later. During thunderstorms or construction activities that produce similar low-frequency noise, survivors experience immediate physical reactions, including increased heart rate, sweating, and disorientation. The complete breakdown of government emergency response systems forced survivor communities to develop their own flood warning networks. Villages throughout the affected region established independent monitoring systems using local residents to track water levels and weather conditions. These community-based warning systems operate completely outside official government channels, reflecting the total loss of trust in authorities who failed so catastrophically during the 1975 disaster. Survivor communities maintain their own food and supply stockpiles, evacuation routes, and communication networks specifically designed to function without government assistance. These parallel emergency systems continue operating today, nearly 50 years after the original disaster. Government authorities systematically suppressed survivor testimony through forced silence agreements that many flood survivors were required to sign. These documents legally prohibited survivors from discussing their experiences with journalists, researchers, or even family members outside the immediate affected area. Survivors who violated these agreements faced harassment, job loss, and criminal prosecution for spreading counter-revolutionary propaganda. Many survivors reported visits from security officials who reminded them of their legal obligations to remain silent about the disaster. The enforcement of these silence agreements continued well into the 1990s, ensuring that survivor testimony remained suppressed for decades after the original catastrophe. Even today, many elderly survivors refuse to speak about their experiences, fearing government retaliation despite the passage of time. The international cover-up. Within hours of the Banqiao Dam collapse, Beijing launched one of the most sophisticated disinformation campaigns in modern history. While hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens lay dead or dying in the floodwaters, government officials began implementing a comprehensive plan to convince the world that nothing significant had occurred. The scale of this deception required coordination across multiple government ministries, diplomatic missions, and state media organizations. Foreign governments that detected unusual seismic activity through their monitoring networks found themselves facing carefully crafted explanations that deflected attention from the true cause of the disturbances. International offers of disaster relief arrived within days of the catastrophe, but China systematically rejected every proposal for assistance. The United Nations offered immediate emergency aid, including medical supplies, food, and temporary shelter materials. The International Red Cross prepared massive relief operations that could have saved thousands of lives. The World Health Organization stood ready to deploy epidemic prevention teams to combat the disease outbreaks that inevitably follow such disasters. Beijing turned down all these offers, claiming that Chinese authorities had the situation completely under control and that foreign assistance would be unnecessary and unwelcome. Chinese diplomats received detailed instructions on how to deflect international inquiries about the unusual seismic readings that monitoring stations across Asia had detected. When the 600 million tons of water hit the valley floor, the impact registered as earthquake activity on sensitive instruments from Japan to India. Foreign seismologists began asking questions about the source of these readings, particularly since they occurred in an area not known for natural earthquake activity. Chinese embassy officials consistently replied that the readings resulted from controlled mining explosions related to industrial development projects in Henan province. This explanation satisfied most foreign governments, who had no reason to suspect that a massive dam collapse could generate seismic activity comparable to a significant earthquake. Foreign journalists who attempted to investigate reports of flooding in central China encountered immediate and systematic harassment. Reporters from major international news organizations found their visa applications delayed indefinitely when they requested permission to travel to Henan province. Those journalists already in China who tried to reach the affected areas were arrested by security forces and held for questioning about their intentions. Several foreign correspondents were expelled from the country entirely after persisting in their efforts to gather information about the disaster. The few journalists who managed to reach areas near the flood zone were prevented from conducting interviews or taking photographs by security personnel who claimed the areas were restricted for military reasons. International communist parties played a crucial role in spreading false casualty figures that minimized the disaster's true impact. Party organizations in Western Europe and Latin America received specific talking points from Beijing that described the Banqiao incident as a minor flooding event that had affected only a few thousand people. These parties then used their media outlets and political networks to disseminate these fabricated casualty numbers to international audiences. Communist newspapers in France, Italy, and Mexico published articles describing successful Chinese flood control efforts that had limited damage to infrastructure and prevented significant loss of life. This coordinated disinformation campaign created an alternative narrative that competed with any accurate reporting about the disaster's true scale. Both American and Soviet intelligence agencies classified satellite imagery that clearly showed the massive devastation across central China. These photographs revealed the complete destruction of entire counties, the obliteration of transportation networks, and the displacement of millions of people from their homes. However, both superpowers made the decision to classify this imagery rather than release it publicly. The United States apparently feared that publicizing the disaster might destabilize the Chinese government at a time when American diplomats were working to improve relations with Beijing. The Soviet Union likely suppressed the imagery to avoid drawing attention to their role in designing the failed dam. This tacit agreement between the rival superpowers ensured that visual evidence of the catastrophe remained hidden from international view. China manipulated international media coverage by providing false footage that purported to show successful rescue operations in the affected areas. Government film crews produced carefully staged scenes of rescue workers pulling survivors from flood debris, medical teams treating injured victims, and reconstruction efforts beginning in damaged areas. However, investigation of this footage revealed that it had been filmed in completely different locations during unrelated emergency exercises conducted months earlier. Chinese officials provided this deceptive material to international news organizations as authentic documentation of their disaster response efforts. Many foreign media outlets broadcast these images without realizing they were viewing fabricated evidence designed to create false impressions about the government's handling of the crisis. Secret diplomatic communications revealed the extent to which Beijing acknowledged the disaster's true scope privately while maintaining public denials. Classified cables between Chinese embassies and foreign governments contained detailed requests for specific types of assistance that contradicted public claims that no help was needed. Chinese diplomats privately requested access to international medical expertise for treating mass casualty events, sought advice on managing disease outbreaks in displaced populations, and asked for technical assistance with large-scale infrastructure reconstruction. These private acknowledgments of the disaster's severity stood in stark contrast to public statements that consistently minimized the event's impact and denied that any significant problems existed. International aid organizations found themselves in the bizarre position of being told their assistance was unnecessary, while evidence mounted that millions of people required immediate help. The International Red Cross received reports from sources inside China describing massive refugee populations living without shelter, food, or medical care. Humanitarian organizations detected clear signs of public health crises developing in the affected regions, but were told by Chinese authorities that intervention would constitute unwelcome interference in domestic affairs. Organizations that attempted to deliver aid independently were blocked at Chinese borders and had their supply shipments confiscated by customs officials. The World Food Programme offered emergency food distributions for displaced populations, but was informed that China's agricultural production remained adequate to meet all domestic needs. This comprehensive information control strategy established the operational template that China would use for managing international perceptions during subsequent major disasters. The same techniques of rejecting foreign aid, manipulating media coverage, providing false casualty figures, and deflecting international scrutiny would reappear during later catastrophes, including the 2003 SARS outbreak, the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, and various industrial accidents throughout the following decades. The Banqiao disaster demonstrated that a determined government could successfully suppress information about even massive catastrophes if it controlled domestic media completely and coordinated its international messaging carefully. The success of this disinformation campaign depended on the international community's willingness to accept Chinese explanations at face value rather than conducting independent investigations. Foreign governments generally chose to respect Chinese sovereignty and avoid diplomatic confrontations over what appeared to be domestic disaster management issues. This approach allowed Beijing to maintain its preferred narrative about the disaster, while millions of Chinese citizens suffered the consequences of the catastrophe in silence. The international community's acceptance of Chinese denials effectively made them complicit in suppressing one of the deadliest disasters in human history. Nearly 5 decades after the Banqiao Dam collapse, the affected region remains a toxic wasteland that scientists describe as an ecological dead zone.